Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor of economics and public policy at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. She's the founder of the top-rated economic blog, New Economic Perspectives, and previously served as a chief economist on the United States Senate Budget Committee and was an advisor to the Bernie Sanders 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns. And her latest book, just out, is The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. And she has an article at the New York Times, Learn to Love Trillion-Dollar Deficits, Our Country's Myth About Federal Debt Explained. Welcome to Background Briefing, Stephanie Kelton.
It's nice to be back with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And let's begin with what you posit in the book. But what if the federal budget is fundamentally different than your household budget? What if I showed you that the deficit bogeyman isn't real? What if I could convince you that we can have an economy that puts people and the planet first, that finding the money to do this is not a problem? So that is definitely taking the scales off our eyes. I guess the challenge now is to make that public policy.
Well, it would certainly be useful if we could overcome this thing that I'm calling the deficit myth. That's, Ian, for me, that's really what this is about. It's about trying to move the conversation to a better, more productive place so that we can have better policy debates, so that eventually we can have better public policy making.
Well, but it's not as if this has just happened today. I mean, in your book, you point out that John Fitzgerald Kennedy, President Kennedy, asked his economic advisor, the Nobel Prize-winning economist James Tobin, back in 1960, he asked him, is there a limit to the deficit? I know, of course, about the political limits, but is there any economic limit? To which the economist Tobin confessed that the only limits are really inflation. And then President Kennedy then asked, that's right, isn't it? The deficit can be any size. The debt can be any size, provided they don't cause inflation. Everything else is just talk. So does that apply today?
Yep, it sure does. And isn't it something that, we've been talking about the deficit the wrong way ever since then. And, I don't think that you can exactly say that JFK did his part to try to help better educate people about public finances. I think it was almost, this is a private conversation. So he confirmed his own suspicions here, but he didn't, gather his economists around and instruct them to go out and help the public gain a better understanding of government finances and quell their anxieties with respect to deficits and so forth. So, unfortunately, it's been a lot of decades since 1960, and we still continue to talk about deficits and debt as if they are clear and present danger to each and every one of us.
Well, the deficit myth, of course, was pushed by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, but I recall that Reagan's economic advisor had to be taken behind the woodshed for a beating because he basically said that, if you cut the taxes on the wealthy, meaning the revenues don't come in, and then you run up defense spending, then you're essentially going to crowd out the possibility of other spending on domestic needs. And that I always thought was a Republican tactic. They've always wanted to go after Social Security and any part of our very, very thin social safety net. They seem to be obsessed with it. So isn't it a political device? And the same thing happened with the tax cuts under Trump. They were essentially a cover to reward people who didn't need extra money.
Yeah, there's no question about it that it is the deficit and the national debt are viewed by many members of Congress, and they're not alone, but as politically useful, right? They are employed periodically, and they become weapons. They're weaponized to serve political interests. So when Republicans want to block progressive legislation, They will pull out the deficit and the debt and say the reason that we can't have these things is because everything must be paid for. So you have to go get all the votes to raise taxes if you want these things. And then the Democrats struggle to come up with the revenue that they think they need to do these things. And so the Republicans can successfully very often shut them down by using fear of adding to the deficit. But as you just said, when it's Republicans' turn, they're more than happy to increase the size of the deficit, provided that it serves their political agenda. So in December of 2017, the Republicans passed huge tax cuts. We now know that they will add to deficits something like $2 trillion over the span of a decade. Now, if Republicans were genuinely averse to deficits and had a true fear of all these negative, bad things happening, surely they wouldn't have been so enthusiastic about passing that legislation. But of course, Republicans understand perfectly well that every deficit is good for someone, because the government's deficit is nothing more than a financial contribution to some other part of the economy. Their deficits show up as surpluses in somebody else's pocket. So what the Republicans did was pass these $2 trillion tax cuts and send the windfall to the people who least need the help in this country. 83% of the benefits went to people in the top 1% of the income distribution. So, and that's on the personal tax cut side. There were corporate tax cuts as well. So they know perfectly well that deficits enrich someone on the other side of the ledger, that their deficits are someone else's surpluses, that their red ink is somebody else's black ink. They just want to make sure that deficits are always and only used. Well, it's a little hard to say that in this precise moment, but in general terms, they like to use deficits to help the people who least need the help.
So you've outlined a number of myths that you've exploded in your book, Stephanie, but let's do myth number 3, how deficits burden the next generation. And that, of course, was perpetrated largely by Ronald Reagan. But you even mentioned that Senator Bernie Sanders, who you advised in both of his campaigns, had echoed Reagan by saying, "I'm concerned about the debt. It's not something we should be leaving to our kids and grandkids." Why is that a myth?
Well, because this thing that we call the national debt is nothing more than part of the U.S. money supply. It is a historical record of all of the dollars that the government has spent into the economy and not subtracted away from us by taxing them out of our hands. Those dollars are currently being held in the form of U.S. treasuries, government bonds. And so I think of them as part of the net money supply of the U.S. They're basically interest-bearing dollars. And, it's the word debt. It's because we call that stock of government bonds, those securities, we label it the debt. And then we hear politicians say, well, we have to pay off that debt and your share of the debt and the debt burden. And we don't have a debt problem. We have a communications problem. It's the way we've chosen to describe things that is so misleading and creates so much unnecessary anxiety. So in that chapter, I walk through in a lot of detail how I think we ought to be, what we're getting wrong when we think about the stock of treasuries, what we call the debt. And I try to correct the thinking. It really is nothing more than somebody else's assets. They're part of our wealth. They're part of our savings. If you're fortunate enough to own some of these things, they are part of your financial surplus, part of your wealth.
Well, you mentioned the 5th myth, of course, is that countries like China and Japan have enormous leverage over us because they hold large quantities of T-bills, etc. And then the 6th myth is that entitlements such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are propelling us towards a long-term fiscal crisis. So just take those one at a time quickly, if you would.
Yeah, well, look, Ian, the first thing, let me just say for your listeners that the book kind of requires everyone to come to terms with the fact that the federal government is the issuer of our currency. The United States government is the issuer of the dollar, And because it is the issuer of the currency, it can never run out of it. It can never face bills coming due in dollars that it can't afford to pay and so forth. So when we get to Social Security in Chapter 6, and we're told that, Social Security trust funds are in crisis, that there's a problem with Medicare, that these programs are unsustainable, the government's not going to be able to keep its promises to future retirees and their dependents and the disabled. That's what Social Security protects, because it's all running out of money. Well, if you've accepted the arguments in Chapter 1 that the issuer of the currency can never run out of money and can always meet any obligation that comes due, as long as the obligation is due in US dollars, since that's the currency, it can always afford to pay. And so that's what I argue in Chapter 6. What was the other one you asked about?
Well, the one before that, which was
China.
idea that Japan and China holding all of our debt gives them leverage.
Right. So again, if you accept the premise in Chapter 1, then you can quickly dispense with this myth, because you realize that the United States government is not dependent upon China or anyone else, including taxpayers, to raise revenue in order to spend. So we've been told that, someday the Chinese might turn off the dollar spigot and no more dollars will come out. And then the U.S. will be in real trouble because we've become dependent on China to pay our bills. We're borrowing from China. They are our lender. They're our banker and so forth. And that's clearly not the case. So we have to correct that thinking. We are no more dependent on China or Japan or private savers or financial markets or anybody else. The federal government's the issuer of the currency. It doesn't need to borrow it from anyone in order to spend the U.S. dollar.
So we've discussed how cynical the Republicans are using the deficit as a way to reward their real constituency, which is the 1% of the 1%. And a good example, by the way, of that is, we mentioned Social Security. Well, the Treasury, of course, borrows against Social Security. It's a huge trust fund. The same is true. The Republican ideologues decided to destroy the post office back during George W. Bush's tenure. And they forced the post office to pay 75 years of pensions in advance, which has crippled the post office. Yep. Meanwhile, Mnuchin at Treasury is borrowing against that huge trust fund of the post office pensions. But he won't give the post office a $10 billion loan to stay alive, because these ideologues want to destroy the post office, which is one of the great American institutions. So that is what I think is the heart of it. Not only do we have to educate people about how these deficit myths are obscuring the reality of what we should be spending our money on, but I think we've also got to be aware of the mendacity of the Republicans.
Yeah, as you're saying, there is always money to fund whatever they deem to be a priority. So that is the simple reality. We've just been given a very nice real world example of how it all works. Congress has moved 4 pieces of legislation in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic and the ensuing economic fallout. We've had 4 bills. The biggest so far that has passed both houses was the CARES Act, the $2.2 trillion. So you say, okay, so when Congress decides that there is an emergency or something urgent, that they want to prioritize spending, they can move a piece of legislation very quickly. Nobody fought about whose taxes needed to go up in order to allow Congress to spend $2.2 trillion. Nobody asked where the money was coming from. We didn't turn on the TV and hear any of that. All they did was write the bill, pick a number, pass the legislation, and it's done. And by the way, that legislation effectively orders up $2.2 trillion from the government's bank, from the Federal Reserve. That's where the money comes from. The legislation instructs the government's bank to go out and carry out payments on behalf of the U.S. Treasury. How can Congress do that? Because it has the power of the purse, because the government is the issuer of the currency. They don't have to find the money to do things. They have to find the votes. And once the votes are there, the spending happens. And the spending is what creates the money, digital dollars, if you like, as the Federal Reserve changes numbers in bank accounts as instructed by Congress. And that's how it works. So you mentioned the post office. If Congress wanted to move a bill and deal with this problem, they could immediately do that. There's absolutely nothing holding them back except political will. And you're right, for the Republicans, there's something in it for them. They would like to see this institution privatized. They'd like to see the assets privatized, and they'd like to see the U.S. Postal Service brought down. And I completely agree with you. It is one of the most important institutions in our nation. And so that's where we are. Well,
it is an extraordinary thing. And I'm very grateful for you bringing this book forward, Stephanie, because it's an important moment. You call it the Copernican Shift, where Copernicus finally explained that the Earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around. So at that level of consciousness raising, let's talk about what this means, though. This means that, for example, you point out the real issues are the $1.7 trillion student debt. That's a burden on 40 plus million young Americans who they're in debt before they even get a job. And we've got this dreadful woman, Betsy DeVos, who's preventing the Congress. And in fact, even the Republicans voted to override her denial of debt relief from these for-profit colleges that are complete scams that rely on taxpayer money to rip off young kids in this country, and particularly veterans. So she is in the pocket of these predators. And even the Republicans in the Senate joined with the Democrats, voted against her, but then one of the rare occasions that Trump he vetoed. So that gives you an idea of the priorities of Donald Trump, Trump University, and Betsy DeVos. These are the kind of people we have that are running our economy. So you have that happening on the one hand, but as you point out, relieving the students of this $1.7 trillion would make an enormous difference to the lives of the young. They could actually start doing stuff that the economy needs, buying houses, buying furniture, refrigerators, cars, etc. And then the overriding issue, of course, of climate change. What has to be done, the enormous amount of spending that's necessary to mitigate that. And then our crumbling infrastructure. So these needs are out there. The needs of Main Street are out there. Wall Street has just been rewarded so obscenely for so long. I don't know how those people can live with themselves. I don't know how Gary Cohn can live with himself. He got so upset about Charlottesville and Trump's affection for the Nazis because he's Jewish, but he hung in there at the White House in order to get the tax cut for him and his buddies on Wall Street. And they are just, as we know, in this coronavirus pandemic, where everybody's hurting, 40 million people out of work, the billionaires are doing better than ever. So that's the America we have. How do we get to the America that you're talking about?
Well, we've talked a little, you mentioned Senator Sanders earlier, and yes, I worked for him, and we've all heard him say it probably 100 times when he talks about how change is brought about. He says change never comes from the top down. It always comes from the bottom up. And I believe that too. And, we're seeing that in the streets right now. We're beginning to see the impact of, thousands and thousands, tens or millions of people coming together and pushing back on an issue. And, whether we get to the point where there is, a critical mass around the ideas that I present in the book, where people begin to demand action on healthcare or student debt or climate. I mean, we've seen those, but it hasn't reached critical mass to the point that we get the legislation for Medicare for all, or for student debt cancellation, or for a Green New Deal. But as people become, I think, better educated about what's possible, because so much of what seems to me stands in our way is that there are a lot of people out there telling us that it's all unaffordable, that it's pie in the sky. We can't possibly come up with the money to fund the kinds of ambitious programs that we're talking about. And that's been pretty effective at shutting things down, because people see the price tag and they say, oh my God, I didn't realize it was going to cost that much money. We would, how could we ever do that? And so I hope that the book helps to, move the ball forward to get us to stop obsessing over the dollar price tag and to reorient the debate so that we're all thinking about the question in terms of our real resources. If we want to do Medicare for all, and we want to provide long-term care and vision care and dental care and all the things that, Senator Sanders had in his proposal, then the relevant question is, do we have the hospital capacity and the doctors and nurses and optometrists and the long-term care providers and so forth? Can we deliver on that goal, on that promise of universal health care? Do we have the real resources to do that? Because the easiest thing in the world to do is to come up with the money. That's the easy part. The challenge is managing our nation's real resources so that we don't try to do too much. And the punishment for that would be straining your nation's productive capacity, where you get an inflation problem. So it's all about how we want to manage our real resources. How many do we want devoted to producing public goods like infrastructure and healthcare and education? And how many of our real resources do we want to leave to the private sector to do the kinds of things the private sector does? Healthcare, hospitality and retail and those sort of things.
Well, Stephanie Kelton, I thank you very much for joining us here today. And I'm grateful for your book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy.
It's always great to be with you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor of economics and public policy at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. She's the founder of the top-rated economic blog, New Economic Perspectives, and she served as a chief economist on the United States Senate Budget Committee and was an advisor to the Bernie Sanders 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns. And the latest book just out is The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. And she has an op-ed at the New York Times, Learn to Love Trillion-Dollar Deficits, Our Country's Myth About Federal Debt Explained. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon. This program is available at backgroundbriefing.org, where you can sign up for email updates as well as subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like this program, you can help us reach more listeners by taking a moment to rate and review us on iTunes, Google Play, and wherever you get your podcasts. And please do share today's program with friends, family, and colleagues on Twitter and Facebook. To help us sustain our mission, spread the word, and keep us corporate free, we have added a donate button. So if you are in a position to give support, please take a moment and visit backgroundbriefing.org/donate, where your tax-deductible contributions will help us continue to build a reality-based community in post-truth America. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another Background Briefing. Bye for now.
Lady dressed in white with a man she loved, standing along the side of the pickup truck. A shot rang out in the night, just when everything seemed right. Another headline written down in America. The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared by half